Dr. Fred Bergsten has been director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics since its inception in 1981. The Institute is the only major research institution in the United States devoted to international economic issues. Dr. Bergsten was Assistant Secretary for International Affairs of the U.S. Treasury and has functioned as Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, representing the United States as a G5 deputy and in preparing G7 summits. Dr. Bergsten worked in the White House under Dr. Henry Kissinger and served as chairman of the Competitiveness Policy Council created by Congress. In addition to being a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Bergsten has received the Meritorious Honor Award of the Department of State, the Exceptional Service Award of the Treasury Department, and the Légion d'honneur from the Government of France. He has been named as an honorary fellow of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It is my pleasure to have him and his lovely wife, Virginia, with us today. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Fred Bergsten.
Thank you, Giselle, for those very nice words of introduction, and also for some things you did not say. Sometimes when people introduce me as having been economic deputy to Henry Kissinger, they go on to note that's a bit like being military advisor to the Pope. I made that comment on a recent program with Henry, and he said, Fred had a very distinguished career in the Carter administration, something quite difficult to have achieved. In other words, Henry, as usual, gets the last word. I had actually looked forward to having Governor Schwarzenegger provide the undercard and warm up the audience for me, but I suspect it's more appropriate that I be the undercard and warm up the audience for him. So the change in order, I suspect, will be congenial to all of you. I'm very happy to be here to help launch this 84th Annual World Trade Week in Los Angeles, which is truly the capital of the Pacific Rim, as last year's keynote speaker suggested to you. I congratulate the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the city of LA, the state of California for their leadership in promoting a very active and constructive trade policy for the United States. I'm particularly pleased to be here today because the trade picture is so much brighter than when you met a year ago. At that time, both exports and imports, you will recall, I'm sure, were plummeting in the wake of the global recession. U.S. trade was in fact dropping by annual rates of 25 to 30%, and the trade of some other major countries, including China, was falling even faster. World trade was falling even more rapidly than in the early years of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so folks like those gathered here, and certainly me, were quite worried about the outlook. We should not have been surprised, however. Since the Second World War, trade has grown by a multiple of world economic growth, rising about 4 times as fast over the last 50 years prior to the recent turndown, and then dropping by a slightly higher ratio in late 2008 and early 2009. But the point is, trade moves in multiples of world economic activity. That happened on the downside as well as the upside, but it should not have been a surprise. Fortunately, trade is now recovering at least as rapidly as it dropped during the world recession. U.S. trade has expanded by annual rates of over 20% since the recovery began in the third quarter of last year, while GDP has been advancing at about 4%. So we're back to a 5-to-1 ratio, a major multiple of trade to economic activity, putting us all, I would say, back in business in a big way. I think we can rest reasonably assured that trade growth is back on a robust track, and we can therefore resume thinking about how to foster it further. That outcome is highly fortuitous, because trade has become a huge contributor to the U.S. economy, and as suggested earlier, looks like becoming even more crucial in the immediate and longer-term future. We've done a number of careful studies at my Peterson Institute for International Economics using a whole series of methodologies. And we have concluded that the U.S. economy is about $1 trillion per year richer as a result of the trade expansion of the last half century. Think about that for a minute. Our economy, which is now worth somewhere around $15 trillion, can attribute at least $1 trillion of that, about 10% of the whole economy at the time we did the study. That's equivalent to about $10,000 per household. All that can clearly, and I would say from our studies conservatively, be attributed to the expansion of international trade. No longer the United States as a continental self-contained economy, but rather one that is deeply integrated into the global economy as a whole. Now, those gains, $1 trillion or more a year, derive from the availability of cheaper and more varied products via imports, higher productivity in our overall economy due to the pro-competitive impact of globalization as a whole, and, very importantly, to the higher wages that accrue to American workers from exporting more of the goods and services that they can produce most efficiently. Those different variables add up to those very large and very critical payoffs to our economy. Now, increased trade, like any dynamic economic activity, of course also generates adjustment costs. No gain without some pain. And in the case of trade, that cost side takes place mainly in the form of temporary job dislocations and, for some workers, longer-term reductions in their earnings. We estimate that those costs run to something like $50 billion per year, obviously a non-trivial sum, but that $50 billion per year of costs pales compared with the $1 trillion of benefits, a benefit cost ratio of something like 20 to 1 that we enjoy from the internationalization of the American economy, even taking full account of the kinds of difficulties, complaints, critiques that Abe Lowenthal mentioned before, and that we know so well from the political debate in this country over globalization. Now, President Obama has recently emphasized the gains from trade and called for a doubling of U.S. exports over the next 5 years, with a goal of creating at least, and I would underline at least, 2 million new jobs, and very good high-paying jobs, as a result. This would require annual export growth of about 15%, but I believe we can and should do much better. In fact, I would suggest today a more ambitious goal. I believe we should seek to double the share of exports in our economy from the current level of about 10% to about 20% by the end of this decade in 2020. If you want a bumper sticker, my proposal is to move from 10 in 10 to 20 in 20. And I think if our trade community could rally around a goal like that, it would give us a kind of mission objective and provide an enormous and quite feasible boost to the U.S. economy as a whole. Such a shift in the composition of the U.S. economy, the makeup of our growth and job creation, is in fact necessary to implement the internationally agreed strategy of rebalancing the world economy, worked out by the G20, the group of 20 leading countries over the last 2 years, under which the United States, to achieve sustainable long-term growth, would no longer rely on debt-financed consumer demand, but rather invest more, export more, sell more to the world. Concurrently, the big surplus and creditor countries, China, Japan, Germany, would no longer rely so much on ever-rising trade surpluses, but would promote increases in domestic demand to sustain their economic activity. The U.S. government has strongly advocated and pushed for that kind of outcome coming out of the global crisis. I think it is essential not only to assure strong recovery from the crisis, but to put our country in a position to have sustained growth over the longer run without a recurrence of the difficulties that we've seen over these last few years arising from the buildup of excessive debt, both in households and in the government, but rather on more firmly based, investment-led, export-led economic strategy.